there everybody, it's markcrilley. I'm back with another how to draw video. Today I've got a kind of interesting idea for a new type of video. I'm going to compare the difference between inking first and then adding color versus starting with the color and then inking last. So I'm going to begin with my Micron 08 Pigma inking pen, the one that I've used for many years. I've gotten used to it, and particularly this size, the 08, is one that I like. I know a lot of people will use considerably thinner than that, and I think I might also break down and use a 03. I've got one here handy. But really not so much about which inking device that you choose to use. It's everyone has their own favorite. But I want to talk a little bit, before I kick it into time-lapse, about what it's like to ink first versus ink last. You know, my feeling is that when you are inking first, you have inevitably an instinct to make it look as good as possible in ink. That probably means adding more and more lines, not necessarily, but trying to make a genuinely beautiful looking pen and ink illustration before you move in with the color. Now that's not necessarily the case. I think a lot of people might be able to anticipate the color yet to come and ink in a light way, but in a way what I wanted to show you is not so much which looks better, because I think that's a rather shallow exercise, but to show you how the coloring approach needs to be different. You need to adjust your coloring approach when you are adding color to a heavily inked illustration. So in a way, I'm going to deliberately ink this in a fairly thorough way, almost as if I did not intend to color it, and then show you how you could add a little bit of color even on top of as I say, a sort of thoroughly inked illustration. So let's go ahead and I'm going to finish off all of the inking in time-lapse, and then I'm going to come back and begin to add a little bit of watercolor on top of it. Alright, well there you have what I would say is a very finished looking pen and ink illustration, typical of something that you would do if you thought it was going to have to be printed in black and white. But sometimes people say, even after you've finished your illustration, can you add color? We need you to add color. Maybe it's an important client of yours. And you never say no to the client. So I'm going to show you how I would add watercolor to a pen and ink illustration such as this. And to me it means basically keeping it light. You don't want to go in with a really dark shade of orange that starts fighting with all that line work that you did. So keeping it light in the case of watercolors means mixing in quite a lot of water with the shade of orange that you've come up with, and not allowing it to be too thick. You know, the thicker the watercolor is, the darker the color is going to be. Now my approach to watercolor is generally to have a sort of a base layer, which is what you see me doing right here. It's just mainly about covering it, almost like carpeting or something. I'm not focused too much on modeling or light and shadow or anything, just sort of getting a first, as I say, base layer that I could build on top of later. But in the case of a pen and ink illustration such as this, there's not going to be so much building on top, frankly. I'm going to maybe add just a little more. And this may be the rare instance of where I can do the coloring all real-time, or mostly real-time, because I don't intend to add so much on top of this first base layer. Let me go ahead though and switch to a shade of green. Give me a moment to mix that up. So yeah, I've mixed up a little green for the stalk. Again, keeping it light, not wanting to obliterate too much of my original line art. And yeah, I think I will actually resort to time-lapse. I knew you couldn't go through this video without me. Well, you know, old man time-lapse, I can't survive without you. Darn right you can't! So I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of time-lapse here as I add just a little more shading by way of a second layer of orange watercolor. So there you see, even with the second layer of watercolor, trying to keep it light, trying not to block out too much of the ink or to sort of be competing too much, let the ink continue to shine and the color plays a kind of a supporting role. Now what I'm going to do now is add a base layer of watercolor to this one, as you see, first before adding any ink, and that is going to affect, I would think, rather dramatically my approach to the coloring and later on to the inking of this piece. But what I'm going to do this time is do time-lapse all through this base layer process, because this is effectively the same. There's no big difference. I think it's going to be during the second and maybe third layer of watercolor that we begin to see some really big differences. So let's go ahead and kick it into time-lapse. Alright, so I've got this base layer in place, and now I can start adding a second layer, and as I said, we may even get to like a third layer. When I do the color first approach, what happens, I find, is that I try to make it look as good as possible with just color, and bring the inking in at the end, and it sort of flips around from what we did with this one. You know, the ink is sort of the star of the show. This time the color becomes the star of the show, and the inking will play a sort of a supporting role. So again, I don't know how much of this I can do in real time. You shouldn't do any of it real time. Nobody likes listening to you talk. But I will maybe talk just a little bit more. One thing I forgot to mention was that the inking pen, I should have said this way back at the beginning, you got to make sure that the inking pen is waterproof. And that's part of the reason that I use this Pigma Micron, is it is waterproof. And, you know, I got to say, some pens that claim to be waterproof are maybe more like water resistant. They're not absolutely 100% waterproof, and you'll see them as you, you know, add in watercolor. Or even markers or whatever, you see them, the line blurring or just somehow reacting to the watercolor or marker that you've added. They've done a real good job with formulating the ink for the Pigma Micron, so that it really doesn't seem to change at all, no matter how much water you put on top of it. And I remember, you know, when I was younger, that I would use whatever ink pen I had on hand, and a lot of them were very water soluble, and just a little bit of spit from your mouth would land on it and really mess up the whole illustration. So just in case anyone out there has not really made the effort to go out and get a waterproof pen, that is absolutely crucial if you're going to add color after you've added ink. So hypothetically, you could get away with a non-waterproof pen using this technique, just because you will have done all the coloring first. You let it completely dry, and then only then do you come back on top of it with the ink. But I'd say, in general, you just go ahead and get a waterproof pen. Because the truth is, this whole idea of ink first, color second, is a little bit inaccurate. The truth is, you may come back in with a little more ink, right? So it'd be ink, water, and then a little more ink, right? And the truth is, I add color, I'm going to add ink, I may come back in with a little more color at the end. It's not quite so clear-cut as doing all of one, completely stopping, and then doing all of the other. Anyway, I think it is time for me to bring back good old man time-lapse to help me finish this off. You're going to see me add increasingly, hopefully subtle additions of color, and I want you to pay especially attention over here where there's this is not really much going on here with the watercolor. Here I'm really going to try to build up shading and so forth with the watercolor and have the ink do less of the work over there. So let's go ahead and get all the coloring done. Alright, so already you can see there's a huge difference in my coloring approach on this one, and this really is the way that I prefer to work, but I do have to be careful not to present this as, you know, everyone ought to do this way instead of this way. No, that's not at all what I mean to say. I'm really just sort of comparing two different approaches, and in a way it's dishonest to compare them too directly, because I deliberately made this one in a very somewhat old-fashioned inking style, very deliberately filled with line work and almost looking a little 19th century. Whereas with this, I am going to go for this much lighter touch with the inking, which I think does, you know, come naturally with this approach of saving the inking for last. I've talked about this in earlier videos, but I can't be sure that everyone has seen those. So I'll go ahead and repeat it, and that is that if you do the coloring first, you can kind of decide, do I need a line there? Maybe I don't. Maybe just let the coloring be the line. And it just lends itself to a lighter inking approach. That being said, as I mentioned before, I'm sure someone who has imagination can ink in a very light way, knowing that they're going to be adding color. And after a number of years, you probably can become very skillful at, you know, doing very light inking to begin with, so as to leave space for all of the color that you want to add later on. Anyway, you can see already that I'm leaving out a lot of the line work. I'm probably going to bring back in a little bit of this sort of vertical line work that you saw me doing there. But you can see my approach is sort of slow and steady, which makes for a pretty boring video. So let's go ahead and kick it back into time-lapse. I'm going to finish off my inking and then come back with a few final words. Alright, well there are the two different illustrations. You can see I added a lot of lines here just to make it more of a fair comparison. I didn't want this one to be super lightly inked and this one super heavily inked. But even so, you can see, I think, important distinctions between them. This one kind of results in a more three-dimensional looking object, whereas this one is more bold and sort of reproducible. It looks like it could be on a t-shirt or a poster or something like that. But let me know what you thought of this video. I would be happy to do more of them. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you to anyone who has supported me by getting any of my books, like Brody's Ghost, my graphic novel series. Also, Mastering Manga, the first of 3 different books, teaching you how to draw in a manga style, and my very latest book, The 2-Pencil Method, featuring my Corgi Joy right there on the cover. Many, many thanks to those of you who have supported me by getting these books, but let me go ahead and lay down this pen. I want to say thank you to all of you who watched this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.